Oil is and has been a vital part of our society for decades. Because we rely so heavily on oil, we are constantly searching for new reserves and extraction technology. Oil is used throughout the world to power factories, cars, planes, heat houses, and so much more. Without oil, our world would arguably come to a screeching stop, and everything we do would inevitably change. According to the CIA, the world's top 5 largest oil-producing countries are Russia, Saudi Arabia, United States, China, and Iran, with Russia producing about 11 million barrels per day, Saudi Arabia producing about 9 million barrels per day, and Iran producing around 3 million barrels per day. All 3 of those countries at some point had a major decrease in oil production and GDP. We will analyze these events in our presentation and the effect on per capita GDP, a critical indicator of economic production. Iran has been one of the largest and most successful producers of oil since 1908. It is currently the second largest OPEC producer and 5th worldwide. Unfortunately, because of their great success, they have discovered about 75% of their estimated total oil already with depleted reserves. In 1979, Iran's Shah was overthrown and a new ruler came to power. Although the country had cut production since 1976, this event simulated further decline. Iran's large dip in production was largely due to the new leader's idea to drastically cut oil production, increasing prices. This caused the 1979 energy crisis in the U.S. when the Americans switched from buying large gas-guzzling cars to smaller gas-sipping cars. Iran's oil production peaked in 1974 at around 300 million barrels a year and hit an all-time low in 1981 at around 66 million barrels a year. When production was at its highest, prices were increasing too. During the Yom Kippur War in 1974, Iran and many other countries inflicted an embargo on the U.S. and any other country that was supporting Israel at the time. Iran cut production by 5 million barrels a day. When production was at its lowest, on the other hand, prices also increased substantially. Oil prices went from $14 in 1978 to $35 in 1981. After 1981, Iran was slowly beginning to increase production, but will most likely never reach the production amount that they once hit in 1974.
In 1933, the Saudi government sold the sole rights to domestic oil exploration to an American-based company that is today Chevron. Over the next several decades, other American partners would invest in this lucrative business venture. In the years following World War I, the state began to increase its stake in this venture until in 1980 it owned the entire entity, later called Saudi Aramco. The state thus controlled the entire production process of oil and relied heavily on revenue from its oil fields that are the largest in the world. A significant portion of the Saudi Arabian economy is built on revenue earned from oil production. Saudi Arabia is currently a member of OPEC, an influential cartel of oil producers. In the early 1980s, oil prices hit a significant high mark when oil-producing giants of Iran and Iraq cut production during military conflict. In response to this event, production in new areas, such as the U.S. and North Sea, caused oil prices to plummet, with growth in supply and a lack of corresponding increase in demand. To counter this, in 1982, OPEC would institute a voluntary cut in production to raise global market prices. This plan completely backfired for Saudi Arabia as the member countries to OPEC did not follow through in their pledges to cut production. Saudi Arabia, however, fulfilled its part of the agreement and cut production drastically over a period from 1982 to 1985, as seen in the Gapminder graph. This cut in production led to a drastic loss in revenue for the state, and the GDP of the country fell significantly over that period. As a result of the noncompliance of other OPEC member states, the price of oil actually fell significantly over the period of 1982 to 1985, from $32 a barrel to $25. Saudi Arabia would boost its production from its 1985 low by breaking a price-fixing agreement with other OPEC countries and instead selling its oil at market prices. This had the effect of grabbing a significant market share away from other OPEC countries. Additionally, oil prices would see a gradual rise in the late 1980s as international demand rose sharply. With its great production capacity and vast natural resources, Saudi Arabia was able to produce more oil and sell it at a higher cost. This would sustain production in the country for many subsequent years. To understand the economy of Russia, it is important to introduce the economic conditions that existed in the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, Joseph Stalin led the state on a program of nationalizing private industry and forced collectivism. This program centered on the mass production of agricultural products. The country could not produce value-added products that fueled industrial growth in other nations. The Soviet economy became dependent on the extraction of lucrative raw materials, such as oil, starting in 1970 from its massive oil fields in western Siberia. The productivity of the people thus hinged on oil prices and production. When oil revenue dropped in 1985 as a result of Middle Eastern production, the Soviet Union began to take massive, burdensome loans. In 1991, the Soviet Union would collapse in a significant part due to this lost oil revenue. At its peak of production in 1988, the Soviet Union was the leading producer of oil in the world at 11.8 million barrels per day. However, after this dissolution period, oil production and the economy suffered. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the energy sector became highly inefficient. Significant reforms would be enacted beginning in 1992 that promoted a market approach to the production. New companies emerged that were permitted to accept foreign investments. However, oil production continued in a steep decline. A significant contributing factor to this fall in productivity was that the government forced companies to sell their oil domestically at just above wholesale price. With so much of the country's oil sold domestically, there was little room for profit in producing more oil. Adding to this, producers could not purchase foreign equipment that was being used to extract oil in other large oil-producing companies. Russian firms were limited to using domestic products which were subpar. This led to a vicious cycle of inefficient practices such as leaking pipelines. When restrictions were lifted, Russian production soared. The Russian government continued to rely very heavily on oil revenue to this day. In the dynamic oil market, there are a number of critical producers, all capable of influencing the overall market and the energy sector of another nation. In each of these states, we see that a number of macroeconomic factors can contribute to a reduction in oil production throughout the entire country. Wars abroad and internal political turmoil can lead to countries devoting less resources towards the production of oil. In Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, we see that a decline in oil production will adversely affect the well-being and production of citizens. In today's market, with oil prices hitting historic lows, these countries stand to lose great revenues should they cut production.